Stephen Moss, a man that needs very little introduction, I think, for most people anyway. I've known Stephen for a long time, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation tonight. This is In Conservation With. I'm David Lindo, and this whole episode is being sponsored by the Diputación de Cáceres, which is the tourism board that looks after the northern part of Extremadura. There's two provinces, so northern province, and then also Leica Sport Optics. They are the other sponsors, so thank you very much. Tonight I got Stephen Moss, my special guest, but before we actually go any further, I just want to, I suppose, pay respects to a legend in the ornithological world who unfortunately passed last week. Some of you may know him, Ian Wallace, a guy that I had the pleasure of meeting a few times, particularly at Bird Fair, but he's a guy that's written many books. He was a great painter as well of birds, and he was very instrumental in many people's development as birders, particularly people who were born in the era of myself and Stephen and others. He's a man that was sorely missed. I mean, I remember reading his books as a kid, should I say, and seeing some of the stuff he talked about, including looking around at flocks of birds, because sometimes there might be something else in amongst them. And that was one of the lessons I learned from him, actually, about observation. I'm not sure what your recollections of Ian Wallace were, Stephen.
Well, it's hardly a time when I didn't know who he was. You know, like you, when I was growing up, when I was about 10 or 11, I was aware of this man. I didn't know his name because his name was always Dim Wallace, D-I-M Wallace. And I didn't know what his first name was because in those days, very formal days, authors of papers used their initials. It was only later I found he was called Ian. I wrote to him when I was about 12 and he wrote a letter back, which I still have somewhere buried in the attic. I would see him at Bird Fair. He would occasionally ring me, and once or twice he'd ring me to ask my advice. And it was a bit like if you were a junior football manager and Alex Ferguson rang you up. You know, it was that sort of level, wasn't it? He was, I would say, when Ronnie Barker died, David Jason said that Ronnie Barker was the governor of comedy. That's what Ian was. People have called him, I've called him the godfather of birding, but it's more than that. He was just like the man. And I think we'll miss him. I was really, really upset when I heard it, as you were on Sunday. I got the news, got a call from Suzanne, my wife, saying Mark Avery's rung, really sad news, you know. And yeah, he was 87, but, you know, that's not the point, really. We've lost a giant, absolute giant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll dedicate this particular episode of In Conservation in the memory of Ian Wallace, who died last week.
Shall I just tell you one thing, though, David? Ian would hate it if we were being glum about it. He would say, go and have a drink, remember me, have a laugh, because he was like that.
Okay, in that case, we're going to dedicate this whole entire episode of fun and laughter
absolutely
to the man who has inspired us all. Okay, Stephen, now you and I go back a long way. I think out of all the kind of illuminaries in birding, I think I've known you the longest, and you've also been instrumental in my career. And I don't know if you know this, Zoomers, but Stephen has been charged with the job, if I go before him, of writing my obituary in The Guardian. And I'm hoping it's going to be a funny one, by the way.
You're not going to go for me, Dave, but should I tell you something? Lucy McRoberts said to me the other day when I rang her about Ian, I said, I'm writing his obituary for The Guardian, which I am. And she said, you know what, Stephen? You now write about live birds and dead people. And I thought, that's interesting, because I'm writing history books now, which are about, you know, birders in the past. So yeah, so I think she's pretty spot on there.
And that's the other thing about you. I always joke when I see you saying, whoops, he's just written another book. Oh, he's just got another book out. Oh, I don't know how you do it because you know, you've got a full active life. Yeah, every 5 minutes you got a new book out. I
Only
don't
two this year.
understand. I want to know your secret, your time management secret. How do you do it?
I find it harder and harder because I'm doing so much teaching now. As you know, I'm teaching some of the people here tomorrow night, which I love, and I teach at Bath Spa, and that it takes up a lot of headspace. Actually, the admin of it, 'cause it's like a proper job, and I'm struggling a bit. I'm going to go off in December for a week to Kevin Cox's little cottage in Devon, where I just lock myself away like a hermit for 6 days and write, and I can do a lot of writing in 6 days without any interruption.
I can believe that. I mean,
You have to be more and more disciplined, don't you now?
if you're saying you're slowing down, what's that? What, two, 3 books a month instead of five?
Two this year, but none next year. I've got one that comes out the year after, but which you can talk about later if you want.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely. But in common with all the books you've written, I mean, I've looked at the Swan, I read the Swan, and it's just packed from the moment you pick the book up and open it with all this information and facts and quotes and stuff. And I thought to myself, I could never, you know, not that I'm any kind of writer in a major way, but I could never write something like that in terms of, you know, all the knowledge you have in terms of quotes from various people and, you know, references from the past. Um, was this book? I know it's part of a series of books, which I'm sure will probably go on forever now. You've got another 10,500 speeches to go. Um, was this book something that took a long time for you to write? And also, why the Swan? And
Yeah, that's a good question. They get easier. The first book was The Robin, as you know, inspired by you, as I said in the book, because you've done the vote on The Robin. I was cycling out one day about a year afterwards, and I thought to myself, hang on, I should do a book about the robin because it's Britain's favourite bird. And that led to the wren, which was easier to write because it was in the same sort of formula, if you like. And then the swallow and the swan are a bit different because they're very different kinds of birds. The swan's the first, it's the first bird I've done that isn't a songbird. You know, it's the first one I've done that is, well, swans are just different, you know. I mean, they're just a bit weird, really, actually. And as I say in the book, the swan isn't really a bird. It's like a national treasure. It's Judi Dench and the Queen and Sir David Attenborough with menace. You know, it's a bird that lots of people love, but we also slightly fear.
what is a swan?
Well, a swan, as you know, is a member of the Anatidae, the ducks, geese, and swans family. But swans are separate. There's about, I think there's 7 species. I might have got that wrong because Coscaroba swan in South America isn't really a swan. 3 of them we know fairly well. Mute swan, of course, the one that you have the picture of there, that most of the book is about, and then Hooper and Buicks. Then, of course, there's black swans and trumpeter swans and black-necked swans, you know. So there's a whole collection of these birds around the world. They're mostly in the northern hemisphere, but not exclusively, unlike geese, of course, for example. So they have spread around the world, and they have been spread around the world. Mute swans have been introduced in a few places as well.
But they have a long history, don't they, in the UK? And that's one thing you've written about quite extensively in the book, their history.
That's right. Well, something I learned, and I learn a hell of a lot when I write any of these books, as you know, when you research anything. I always knew, as you do, and many people here will know, that Hooper and Buick swans are often called wild swans. There's a Yeats poem, The Wild Swans at Cool, which is about Hoopers. But people often say, oh, the wild swans are back. And they mean Hooper and or Buicks. What I hadn't realised was the reason they were called that was that this bird that we're looking at now was the tame swan. And for many centuries, it wasn't regarded as a wild bird at all. William McGillivray, the great Victorian writer, didn't even put it in his book. He said, you know, Mr. Yarrell's put it in his book, and I can't think why, because it's a tame bird, you know. It would be like having domestic geese in a bird book. And if you look back at early bird reports from the early 20th century, they very rarely mention mute swans, because mute swan was considered to be not, yeah, it's basically a domesticated bird, and they were semi-domesticated. So yeah, it's a bizarre story, which I explain in the book.
Yeah. By the way, little notes. William.
McGillivray.
Yeah, I've never been able to pronounce his name, and he's got a warbler to his name, which I can't pronounce.
He has. He's got McGillivray's warbler. He was a very lugubrious and rather a Scot with a chip on his shoulder. Can we put it that way? He was a difficult man. He was not liked. He was not respected by London ornithologists, but he was a great ornithologist. His 5-volume book of book of British birds is extraordinary. And the reason it failed, I mentioned in Mrs. Moreau's warbler, is that he renamed every single bird. So redwing was red-winged thrush, and all of them had not even names that, and you think, what the earth that? White rumped stonejack for wheat ear. He decided to give them all names, and everyone got the book and went, well, that's rubbish, we don't call it that, and that was it. But his name's never caught on. My favourite one was Provence fursling. What do you think Provence fursling is?
Fursling.
Fursling.
Fursling, as in common in Surrey.
No, furs as in gorse, but it's found on Thursley Common.
Dartford warbler.
Very good, Dartford warbler. He called it the Provence fursling.
I like that.
I know. I'm thinking of reintroducing it.
It's like a friend of mine who's not a birder. I remember talking to him about shovelers, and he calls them chevalers.
Yeah,
quite nice.
I had a friend at school who couldn't pronounce bird names, and we used to go out birding, and he called them savage warbler, sledge warbler, which I love. So it's like, anyway. Sorry, we've got off swans, but yeah.
But you talk about tame swans. I mean, I've always imagined mute swans to be introduced to the UK back in the Norman times. I also thought that they historically came from the Baltic area and were kind of quickly domesticated and used as food. Am I wrong?
Yeah, you're wrong, I'm afraid. They were here back in Neolithic times, if not before. They've probably been here forever, probably in quite small numbers. And of course, as you know, the fens were drained in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Lots of birds like the crane and bittern disappeared from Britain. The swan didn't, because by then it had been taken into, not captivity, because you can't keep swans in a cage like chickens or ducks or something, but you can clip their wings and keep them and breed from them and then eat the cygnets, which is what they did. So actually, the myth was that Richard the Lionheart, brought swans back on his way back from the Crusades. But it turns out to be nonsense. That's one of the first times it was written about, but they would have been here. But that was really after that they became the royal bird, and swans were like a sort of status symbol. It was like, a dictator now would give his friends perhaps, the right to have a piece of land or something. Well, the kings of England in those days would give swans as a gift, or the right to own swans as a gift to their favoured nobles. And if you were caught stealing a swan or killing a swan or injuring it or taking their eggs, it was considered treason.
Incredible. So they were used as food. I remember reading somewhere about King Henry VIII having a whole ton of them on in a banquet. So was he eating adults and not cygnets?
Both. They ate both. They tended to eat the cygnets because the cygnets were, firstly, then they could keep the adults and breed from them. But so it was a bit like lamb. The cygnets were less tough than lamb is to mutton. But they did eat adult swans, and of course they would present them at the banquet. They'd often stuff them with all the other birds. So it went, swan, bustard, I don't know what would be next, goose, chicken, down to quail. And you get this incredible thing, and they present it with the skin of a swan and the beak, and the wings out to look so spectacular, because it was a status symbol. It was saying, look at me, I can serve the most expensive food, along with all the cranes and bitterns and all that stuff as well. I mean, it was utterly bizarre, really.
I remember when I was on the One Show, BBC One Show, I did a piece on swans, and I went along the Thames and did a bit of swan upping. Which I'm sure you'll explain what that is to the Zoomers. But I remember picking up, I had to pick up a cygnet, and it was quite a well-grown one, and it was like holding a furry brick.
Yeah.
I mean, it's substantial, but really furry.
Yeah. And swan upping is this weird thing, as you say, where they go along the Thames and they catch the swans and then they mark them. They used to mark them. This is a great story. They used to mark them by cutting marks in their bills. And the different marks, which go back right the way to about the 11th century, would denote who the owner was. Because on the Thames, it's the Queen, the Worshipful Company of Vintners, and the Worshipful Company of Dyers. So it's a weird story. Chris Perrins, the great ornithologist at Oxford, who is now officially the, I think he's the master or the keeper of the Queen's swans now. He persuaded them to stop marking them because he said what you get is a lot of blood, and it just didn't look very good, you know, when it was being filmed for things like the One Show. So they now just put rings. They put a ring on, and the BTO ring, and then they put a coloured ring which says it belongs to one of those companies.
So it's not true to say that all the swans in the UK are royal property.
No, they don't all belong to the Queen, by no means. Many of them on the Thames do. It's roughly half that are hatched. But lots of birds now, they don't get as many on the Thames because the birds go off and breed on gravel pits and things. The other funny thing about the swan, the nicks on the bill, was there's some pubs. There's one in Bristol and a few others around the country called the Swan with Two Necks. And there's a sign showing the two necks of the swan. And it's not necks, it's nicks. It's a swan with two nicks on the bill.
Wow.
It's one of those great, you know, weird misunderstandings.
That is
Lots of myths about swans. You know, they can't break a man's arm with a single blow of their wing.
that is, you know what, that particular urban legend I'm quite happy about, because it then stops kids and other people approaching them thinking in the back of their heads that they might get a broken arm from it.
Yeah. But people are, you know, I mean, I do recount in the book how there's a lot of targeting of swans. And I don't think it's even just kids. I think, you know, there's a lot of idiots out there with their rifles and catapults. And the thing about a swan is if you kill a swan or injure a swan, people are going to find it. It's not like a mallard, which is going to hide away or sink, you know, and you're not going to notice it. It's a big white bird. And unfortunately, they are targets for people.
So, okay, actually, when we chatted about swans previously, before, you know, we did this live event now, I mentioned something I read and learned about years ago, and I wasn't sure, because I remember we talked about it, and that was the fact that, you know, swans have been eaten a lot by the noble people of the UK, or England at least, to the point by which they were actually becoming extinct. And apparently legend has it that turkeys were brought over from America, and people suddenly realized actually turkey tastes a lot better than swan. And the turkey saved the mute swan from extinction. Is that a myth? Or
I don't know. And I'm looking into the wild turkey for my next book as one of the chapters. And I will definitely check that out because it's not in this book. Swans, I mean, I don't think swans would have been going extinct. I think, if anything, the point at which they were in trouble was the point at which people stopped eating them, because then there's no incentive to keep them, because they're quite awkward, difficult birds to keep, and, you know, they're feisty. And I think by the 19th century, people weren't eating swans as much, and the whole nobleman thing had gone. And swans were basically, those tame swans were allowed to breed on their own, and the cygnets were not harvested. And swans are, you know, like all big birds, there aren't that many in Britain. You know, I can't remember what the population is now, but yeah, it's in the thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. And therefore, they're, like a lot of birds, they're quite vulnerable to things like cold winters and poisoning. I mean, yeah, the way our rivers are at the moment, with raw sewage being pumped in, is clearly not good for swans or any other bird on the river. Disturbance, of course, fishing lines, flying into electricity pylons and wires, you know, swans can die in a remarkable variety of different ways.
so mute swans are deemed as tame swans, or at least used to be. Are there actually any wild mute swans?
Well, there are now, but there probably weren't. I mean, I think what would have happened is, you mentioned the Baltic, there were swans in Northern Europe, and it's quite likely that in very hard weather in the Middle Ages, wild mute swans would have come over to the east coast of Britain and maybe then stayed and interbred or bred with the local population. So I think there always have been. Swans are native to Europe. You know, it's not like they were brought here like pheasants, which obviously, as you know, are sort of Southwest Asia. It's not, it's not like they were brought here and released. They're very much a British bird, unlike the pheasant. But as I say, I think that legacy of the tame swan means we've always slightly taken them for granted, and the fact they don't fly away when you go near them. So people just think, oh, it's like, they're like a tame bird.
Yeah, it's funny you say not flying away, because I remember being in Latvia, and I was in Riga with this ornithologist who was taking me around the city. And it was in the evening. I remember walking, we went to some area of really kind of post-Soviet Union era, horrible blocks of flats. And behind it was a lake. And I was standing on the shore of the lake with this guy. And I remember watching some common gulls. And I heard him rustle a sort of a plastic bag. And I turned around and I saw him produce some bread from the bag. And he proceeded to throw bread out to feed the swans. And I was thinking, are you supposed to be an ornithologist?
Yeah.
So anyway, I ignored him and carried on looking. Next thing I heard a kerfuffle, and I turned round, and he had grabbed one of the swans, was on top of it, and proceeded to ring it. And
I'm glad you said ring it. I did wonder.
I thought, that's a man. He came straight up back in my estimations.
Yeah, we have to be careful. I mean, they can get you with that beak.
Yeah, they're pretty. They are. The mute swan is what, the Britain's heaviest bird? Is it one of
It's
the
the largest and heaviest bird. It's the same length as a whooper swan, but whooper swans are quite a bit lighter, probably because they migrate. They're about 20% lighter generally. Of course, there's a lot of variation. Great bustard and mute swan are pretty, similar to each other in terms of weight. Probably the average great male bustard is probably heavier.
Wow. Mute swans in the UK certainly have this, for most people, have this sort of angelic sort of, people have pictures of them displaying and their heads are together to make a heart shape as a, so people see them in this really beautiful light, but are they as loved as we may think?
I don't think they're as quite as universally loved as, say, the robin. But what's interesting about swans is people who do love them are really obsessed with them. So go on Twitter in spring and you will see dozens of photos of new broods of cygnets, which is lovely. People post it. There's quite a lot of pure swan accounts on Twitter. And I think that's great. People. So I think they're loved. At the same time, I think some people fear them, and that probably goes back to childhood when you went to feed the swans, ducks, and a swan came in and sort of bashed you, and you're a little toddler, and this huge white thing's over you. But as you say, they're also a symbol of purity and fidelity. The one myth that is sort of true about swans is that they mate for life. Of course, there are exceptions, but by and large, they mate for life, and even more so Buick swans. Buick swans, they've only known in all the years of study at Slimbridge, thousands of swans, I think it's over 10,000 now that they've identified as individuals. They've only ever had two what they call divorces, where one went off and came back with a different partner while the first partner was still alive. And it's very, very unusual in Buick swans. Less so in mute, but it's still something like 95%. Fidelity. So since ancient Greek times and Roman times, swans have been this symbol of purity because they're white, fidelity because they mate for life. And so they're in a lot of ancient mythologies all around the Northern Hemisphere, North American First Nation peoples, Scandinavia, Iceland, Finland, all the way across Russia, Japan. There's a lot of swan mythology. I would say they're second only to the raven as a sort of international bird of mythology. Interesting.
In the UK, as you say, we have three species of swan: the hooper, the Buick, and the mute. And the mute is obviously quieter than the other two.
Yeah,
but not quite mute.
Not quite mute at all. No, they make quite a few noises. They're called mute because when they fly, they don't honk. Hooper swans and sometimes Buick swans call. Well, they call when they're in flight. Mute swans never call in flight. They make that extraordinary sound, that with their wings, that Paul Theroux described as a couple making love in a hammock. I don't know if he's ever heard a couple making love in a hammock. I haven't, or indeed been in a hammock. I can see you're thinking now, aren't you? Trying to
Yeah, I'm very shy, I must say, but I've not
heard
thought
that.
of that one before.
Yeah, it's a good one though, isn't it? So
Yeah,
yeah, they aren't entirely mute, but they are quieter than the other two.
I've
That's partly
also,
because they don't migrate. Hooper swans and Buick swans have to call because they have to keep in touch when they're migrating through fog and things.
yeah. I mean, I read that mute swans are actually more closely related to black swans in Australia than they are to Hooper and Buick swans. Does
That's
that
correct.
mean that the black swan in Australia is also quiet and also makes a whooshing noise?
That's a really good question. I don't think they're entirely quiet, but I don't think they call as much. So trumpeter swan, Hooper swan, and Buicks are more closely related, and they all make that honky sound. They've also got that very long Roman nose bill, haven't they? All three of them. Buick slightly less so, but trumpeter and Hooper have got that enormously long bill. Trumpeter is the one swan in the world I've never seen in the wild. There was one around the Somerset Levels for a few years, but I never actually bothered to go and see it because it was an escape.
That wild trumpeter?
No.
Yeah.
It was an escape from somewhere. But I've never seen them in the States. I've seen all the others. I've seen black-necked swan in South America and the Falklands. I've seen black swan in Australia.
Yeah, I've never seen a wild black swan
Ah,
in Australia. It's the only one I've seen trumpeter, and I've seen even the coroba.
Scorobi, I've seen that one, but he's not a swan.
But the black neck swan, is that sort of related to the mute swan? There seems to be two groups of swans here: the sort of the mute swan types, and then the Roman nose types. So
I think they are, or if not, they're in the same thing. I mean, they're all in the genus Cygnus, so we say they're not closely related, but they're pretty closely related. Or unless, of course, as they're doing a lot now in science, aren't they? They're now. I noticed the other day that all the doubling ducks are not anus anymore, except two of them are. But the shoveler and the gargany are in a separate
genus, as is widgeon
as
something
is
else as
widgeon.
well.
That's right. So I get very confused now. They did it with gulls as well, black-headed gulls. So I mean, the whole point about scientific names is I thought that they were the same, but they're not anymore. I'm getting old, aren't I?
Yeah, I must admit I find it a little bit tiresome, all the splits of terms of different names and stuff. It's getting, it's harder to categorize things, and it's harder when you're trying to introduce new people to it.
Yeah, Ian Wallace would have been with you there. Ian hated splitting. Brett Westwood told me today in an email. He said Ian hated splitting. He said, look, just because it's got a different colour under its tail, the birds still know what it is. I thought that was lovely.
But it's interesting with mute swans because I'm based, as you know, in Extremadura in southwest Spain, and I couldn't believe it, but last year I went to Twitch a mute swan.
Your Extremadura list.
Yeah, they're actually pretty unknown here in southwest Spain, and in fact this year I found three.
Well,
Sorry to keep you up, Stephen. This year I found three.
It's been a long day.
I found three, but I've also been quite dismayed to find that some people have been ticking black swan here in Extremadura. I think there's one knocking around in the region, which obviously escaped from some collection, and they're putting it on their lists, which I find a bit kind of stretching it a bit.
Well, black swan in Britain, as Paul's pointed out, they're in Dawlish, although they died of bird flu there. But there's something like 50 or 60 records in the Atlas each year of breeding. So I think black swans are on the cusp of becoming an official British bird. I think it could happen in the next 10 years or so. They are all swans, but particularly black swans, are quite susceptible to bird flu, though, which is not good news for them or us. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, because I was reading in your book that the black swan in particular is very susceptible to succumbing to bird flu.
Yeah, and they're studying it because of COVID. They're trying to study how it's transmitted and that sort of thing. And that's ironic because the black swan, of course, COVID was a black swan event, as they call them, meaning something we should have seen and didn't see coming.
You wrote about the black swan and how it came to people's notice. I mean, it was originally, 300 years ago, no one even knew that black swan existed.
That's right, yeah. It was end of the 17th century. So what happened was in the Greek and Roman proverbs, there are proverbs saying, it's as rare as a black swan. And it was those proverbs were clearly written centuries, millennia before black swans were discovered. So the phrase black swan, even in English, meant an impossible event. And then they turned up. And it was a classic example of just because all swans you've seen are white doesn't mean all swans are white. And there's some lovely stories in the Australian Aboriginal culture about how the swan became black and all those things, and they're the state bird of Western Australia. They're quite a iconic bird out there, just as swans are to us.
Yeah. As a kid, I was very obsessed with, and I still am, birds that have either become extinct or were on the verge of extinction. And one of the classic birds that I read about was the trumpeter swan, and how that teetered and nearly went.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I suspect it wasn't quite as rare as people thought. What happened was they wintered in a particular place, and that was down to something like 60 birds, or I can't remember what the figure is, but a very small number. And then they did discover another population somewhere completely different in, I think, South Alaska or Western Canada. But I think they were probably down to the hundreds, So, and for big birds, as you know, take a long time to replenish population. They then turned it round. There was a real effort to stop hunting of migratory birds and birds anywhere. This was after the plumage trade as well in America. So from the 30s onwards, they started to bounce back. The bird that they really hate, though, in America is mute swan, because mute swan is a feral bird, and their attitude to mute swans is very similar to our attitude to Canada geese. If you go to Canada, people love Canada geese because they're this beautiful wild bird that migrates, and it's very evocative of the seasons. And we think Canada geese are, things that just crap everywhere, which they are. They have the same view of mute swans, because mute swans particularly the northeastern United States, where they're very common, cause real problems to lake and estuary ecosystems.
Yeah,
they eat crap everywhere.
Yeah, because I remember being in Connecticut a few years ago, and I was chatting to ornithologists there who said they really hated the swan because they obviously are not, that they upset the ecological balance. But like with parakeets in London, there are people who love them and have never seen anything done to them.
Absolutely.
But apparently at night, people would go out and kill the swans under the darkness.
And eat them, hopefully.
Probably not. I think it'd be a wasted meal. In fact, I think, I think they weren't actually. They weren't. I wonder what they taste like. It reminds me.
They taste like a sort of tough, gamey chicken. Like most things do, really.
Yeah.
I'm not excited by the prospect of eating swan. It's never been offered. I haven't been to dinner at the palace, so.
Yeah. It reminds me.
When we get our knighthoods, David, maybe we'll ask the Queen if we could have a special swan.
Listen, you've been getting a knighthood way before me. It reminds me of a joke I heard in Serbia. A man was put up in court for killing and eating great bustard. And the judge says, I'm afraid you're guilty. We found you guilty. Why, firstly, the question I need to ask is, what did great bustard taste like? And he said, well, the thing is, before I even asked that question, I had to kill the great bustard because my family is starving and, we had no other food. But the great bustard didn't taste as nice as the Eastern Imperial Eagle or the black stork.
That's very good.
For those who may not get that joke, the other two species are even rarer in Serbia than the bustard.
Now I'm going to have to tell a joke now, which is something along the lines of when someone, what's the best way to cook a swan? And they said, well, you boil it for 20 hours, surrounded by old rags, and then you drain the saucepan, throw the swan away, and eat the old rags. It's not very good, but you know what I mean. So I don't think it would taste very nice. Mrs. Beaton, who had a recipe book that I'm old enough that my nan, who brought me up, used Mrs. Beaton's Victorian recipe book for cooking. And my nan never cooked roast swan, which was in there, or lark pie. which starts with "Take 4 skylarks."
Wow.
So we didn't eat that in the suburbs of London, but but it was in the book.
When does the book come out, by the way? Is it out already?
It was out last Thursday. Yeah, and it.
Haven't got a cover that you can show us?
I don't have it with me, stupidly. I've got it in the car because I'm going to give a talk on Wednesday down in Ilminster. So I've taken a copy with me. So I haven't got it here. But it's very beautiful. I could share my screen with you.
Yeah, let's do that. So people
Keep
can
talking. Ask me another question and I'll find you the cover.
yeah, people can actually see. So whilst writing the book, I mean, have you actually an affinity with swans? I mean, do you feel, like obviously some people.
Yeah, I think I do. I think of the birds that I've written about in this series, which is the robin, the wren, the swallow, and the swan, I have to say the swallow is now my favourite bird. It's leapt ahead of swift, which used to be my favourite bird. And I think something about swallows is just absolutely magical. But I've learned to respect swans more, I think, by doing this. I think that's how I felt really about them. That they've got a lot more to them than I thought, because like a lot of birders, I'd sort of taken them for granted. Because we do, don't we? As I said earlier, that we don't think of, if you write a list of birds, you don't necessarily write down, swan on your list when you go out birding for the day. I think we do take them for granted, and that's a pity. I'm just going to share my.
That's interesting because when I birded my local patch, Wormwood Scrubs, very nice.
That worked.
It's a very atmospheric picture, actually. Who painted that?
It's from a library, and it's a guy who I hadn't heard of, who is a bird artist and is still around. They get them from, oh sorry, they all the pictures on these books, they take from libraries. So I said I wanted a swan looking beautiful, looking like this. They've done the lovely orange lettering there, and there's an orange bookmark in the book, which is so clever because it's the colour of the bill, which I love. All right, I shall stop sharing now.
Yeah, very nice book cover. I mean, I was going back to taking them for granted. I mean, I used to be very happy to see a mute swan fly over my local patch in Wormwood Scrubs, because it was a bird I've very rarely, in fact, any kind of water bird is very rarely seen. And there is something very majestic about them flying over such a huge bird, and you kind of see them on a lake, and then they become transformed into this amazing, huge, flying object.
Yeah, and of that effort to take off is so huge. There's a brilliant advert that I mentioned in the book. It's worth looking up on YouTube. Back in the 80s, KLM, the Dutch airline, did a series of adverts, and they had a swan taking off, and they used the sound of an air traffic controller talking through the takeoff as the swan takes off. And it's so clever, because that's what they're like. They have to get up to a really high speed before they can get off the water. And of course, if they're on ice, if the water freezes, they're stuck, because it's really hard. They can't take off on ice because they slide. So they can get a little bit, they can get themselves in trouble like that. And in fact, those hard winters in the early 60s that not even I remember, caused quite a big population loss of swans.
Yeah. I mean, you always think of swans as sort of serenely sort of paddling on lakes or rivers and stuff, but I've also seen them on the sea.
Yeah, occasionally you see them on estuaries a lot, I think, more. But yeah, you occasionally get them on the sea. You get them on village ponds. They're in the city, of course, aren't they? They're on Hyde Park, on the Serpentine. They're a bird that you sort of see everywhere in lowland Britain, really. And I think that, again, like all these birds, the reason I write about the robin and the wren and the swallow and the swan is that they're common. I'm interested in them because people do slightly take them for granted. And we shouldn't do that with common birds. You've always championed the birds we can see. And in fact, if I do another biography, which, as Mark Cocker said, you've only got 230 British birds to go,
I'm looking bigger. I'm looking at 10,500.
Yeah, there you are. Yeah, maybe 11,000 now. Well, I've done Mrs. Moreau's Warble, haven't I? I think if I do another one, which I'm not doing for next year, I'm having a year off from this because I'm writing this other book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. I'm going to do the Sparrow, which
Okay,
you're going to be
yeah.
heavily implicated in because I've interviewed about the Sparrow for Birds Britannia. You know, there's a lot of great Sparrow stories. Being a Londoner like me, you know sparrows very well. So I think that's going to be the next one because again, brilliant stories to tell.
Yeah, because I remember
Brilliant behaviour, weird decline, big cultural story with the sparrow, you know. And it sums up something about the British. All these birds tell you something about the British, not always, as you said about the robin when you did your vote, not always very enlightening, you know, or edifying. You know, the fact that the robin's a nasty, violent bird that doesn't like its neighbours very much. Oh, who's that remind you of? Which I think you said something along those lines at the time, and you were right, you know. So, and I think that, of course, the swallow's different from that because the swallow doesn't know boundaries and doesn't care in that way.
But is the British mentality different to the rest of the world? Because we're selling ourselves as such, politically and even geopolitically. But I mean, in terms of, you know, for example, our feelings towards swans, would you have the same kind of feeling in Poland?
You do in Denmark, funnily enough, because in Denmark it's the national bird and it replaced the skylark back in the 80s. And that, of course, is because of Hans Christian Andersen and the Ugly Duckling. And I'm not going to sing it, but Danny Kaye sings a lovely version of the Ugly Duckling. And that's a very famous children's story. It's a very interesting, like all Hans Christian Andersen stories, there are twists to them. They're more interesting than you think. And that is a great story, you know. So yeah, and you're right. I mean, obviously, nationalism and racism and suspicion of foreigners exists in every country, and parts of Eastern Europe are worse than anywhere, really. But we're not doing very well on it, are we? And at the end of The Swallow, I write about the fact that the swallow teaches us a lesson of crossing boundaries, and the fact that everywhere you go in the world, people say, "Oh, our swallows are back." If you go to South Africa, and "Oh, our swallows are back." They're not your swallows, they're our swallows. But, you know, I love that about the swallow. That's why the swallow is my favourite, because it literally crosses all the continents. It's found everywhere, even been seen in Antarctica.
Exactly, yeah. Been everywhere.
Extraordinary story.
But we're just keep to the swan thing. Cobs and pens, male and female swan. I think I know why the female's called a pen, but if you can explain why they're called cob and pen.
Well, that's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. Why is the female called a pen?
I think the female's called a pen because back in the day when they used to use quills,
Ah,
was the swans.
quill pen. Might be. Might be. All I know is the cob has a bigger knob.
Well, that's true.
So that one behind you, I think, is a pen. That looks like a small knob to me.
That's true as well, yeah. And do you know if the knob has any function?
I think, well, the fact that the male's is bigger suggests that it probably does. But it's odd, isn't it? Because again, Hooper and Buicks don't have it. You know, the mute's the only one that's got it. So it's a very, you know, it is slightly weird. Again, like all these things, when you look closely at a bird for long enough, you start noticing really weird things. The swallow, you know, what a weird bird. Doesn't look like any other, apart from martins, obviously, it doesn't look like other songbirds because it has to fly. And the swan, you know, the size it is, it's had to develop. So like a lot of water birds that don't come out of the water much, it's hopeless on land because it has to have its paddles, its legs far back, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to move. You know, so it's as you said, it's rubbish at taking off and not very good at landing, but very good at flying. But that, and I imagine I think a swan is about as big as a flying bird can get. Trumpeter swans, I think, potentially even bigger. Dalmatian pelicans, which you've got in the back, one of you, haven't you there? Lovely, or pelicans anyway, possibly Dalmatian. You know, but yeah, these are all at the limit of what a bird can fly at in terms of size and weight.
Yeah. Someone's just written in the chat that the female's called the pen because of the way she holds her wings back.
Ah,
Pen's manner from the
thank
English
you,
term
Claire. How did I
penne.
miss that? I'm going to have to put penne is an Italian term.
Penne. Yeah, penne pasta.
Oh, it's American white pelicans.
But
I didn't think they were Dalmatian. They look a bit small. Yeah.
the other question is Cobb. Maybe Claire, you can do some
Well, Claire's
research.
Googling frantically. I'm glad she didn't know that. Well, she might have known that. She's checking it.
Yeah, because it's just interesting where these.
I have to say, it didn't occur to me, which is very silly of me given my obsession with bird names. It didn't occur to me to look up while I was writing the book what Cobb and Pen come from. I don't think,
I
anyway.
think you need to talk to me more often.
I do. Maybe I've forgotten. Maybe it's in the book, but I haven't read it for a while.
No, you just haven't talked to me. With swans, the other question I want to ask you, which I've always been fascinated.
Ah, I knew that. Sorry, Claire's done it. I did know that it came from Knopf, meaning knob. I don't think it's in the book, but I think I knew that. I'm going
Okay,
to look it up now. I'm going to look up and see if it's in the book while you're talking. Sorry, ask me another question about swans.
so just to let the people know who can't see the messages here, the male swan is called a cob due to the knob on its beak. This comes from the old German term Knopf, Knopf,
I think so. Knopf.
meaning knob. Okay, so we've learned something new today. In fact,
There we are.
I think the mute swan's not the only one with a knob,
Black swans have a little knob, I think.
and I think black neck swan has a knob as well.
I think you might be right. I think they do. You haven't seen one for a while.
But even though dear Ian Wallace may not have been a keen fan of splits, actually I'm kind of a little bit interested in that because you look at the Buick swan, and then you got the tundra swan in North America, which is similar, slightly bigger. Its beak is predominantly black. I remember seeing one in Cape May, in fact, two in Cape May in New Jersey. And for me, they felt very different to Buick swans. I'm just wondering why aren't they split?
Yeah, they were split, of course, for many years, weren't they? It was the whistling swan and the Buick swan, and now they're the tundra swan. And they look completely different. Again, I've never seen them in the wild. I've seen them in collections. I have just looked up knob, and in the book I do mention the fact that the Dutch name for swan is Nobelzwaan, which means swan with a knob. There we are.
Were there other sort of old English names for swan, or has it always been called swan?
No. The funny thing about swan is that there's probably one or two folk names, but swan is one of the oldest bird names, like goose. And the reason you know this is swan. I've just said Swan in Dutch. In Dutch and German and English, if the same name is in those three languages but not in Scandinavian, then that means that name is roughly 2,000 years old. But if it's in the same Scandinavian languages as well, like swallow and swan are in both, then they basically means that is thousands of years old. And that is a really, really interesting point about bird names, that if the name goes back, if it goes back long enough, you can see that it's the same name in Scandinavian and German and English.
Oh, and what does swan mean?
We don't know. It's like all these. Once when I first wrote my book about bird names, I'd go and give talks, and I'd say, "Ask me a bird name, and I'll tell you what it means." And people would say sparrow or swallow or wren or swan or goose or duck. Well, these are all so old that we have no idea what they mean. Whereas, obviously, more modern names, we do. You know if a name like, well, not even modern names, names like wheatear, we know means white arse. So swan goes right the way back. It may refer to something to do with its sound. I mean, almost all really ancient bird names are onomatopoeic, but we've lost that. So we don't know.
But swans, of course, feature very heavily in culture, certainly in Britain. I mean, I can't think of, any street without, well, I know pubs are becoming quite rare now, but there's loads of the swans out there.
Right. It's the commonest bird name for a pub by a long way. And there are also black swan pubs. There are white swans, of course, the white swan and the black swan sometimes in the same area. And the reason is for that is that pub names originated when people couldn't read, and so they needed to know from the sign what the pub was called. Well, if you have a duck, it's like, is it a duck or is it something else? Was it a goose or a duck? Swans are obvious, aren't they? They're white. So Red Lion, White Hart, Swan, Rose and Crown. They're the classic, the Crown. They're the classic pub names, and they're there because they're really easy to identify.
And the other thing about swans is they've also entered into our language, haven't they? Because you talk about swanning around and things like that. Is that purely a British thing, or do?
Yes, I think it is. I don't know enough about the other languages, but I'm pretty certain it's because bird names used in language are often, it's very hard to tell sometimes which came first. So when we say the word sniper for someone who's very good at shooting accurately, that comes from people who could kill snipe. And swanning around comes from that. But when we say, oh, he's grousing about something, that's nothing to do with the bird. It's just a coincidence. So, it's a tricky one. Read the book, the other book.
And speaking about the other book, what is the other book you're working on?
The other book I'm working on at the moment is called 10 Birds That Changed the World. And I'm very excited by it because it's proper history. I mean, Mrs. Moreau's Warbler and A Bird in the Bush were histories, but they were histories of very specific things, of bird watching and bird names. This is really a history of the world told through our relationship with certain species of bird and what happened next, if you like. And in many cases, the relationship we have with that bird teaches us that when we mess around with nature, it messes back with us. So it's a whole range of birds. It starts with the raven as the bird of mythology, goes through things like the dodo for extinction, Darwin's finches, of course, in the Galapagos. I've been writing today about snowy egret, the whole story of bird protection and conservation, how they were nearly made extinct because of the fashion trade. Other really brilliant stories like the Guanay cormorant, which led to massive slavery and colonial exploitation, because basically Guanay cormorants, as you know, nest off Peru where it doesn't rain, so there's piles of shit which is worth a fortune, and that basically kick-started the agricultural revolution in Europe. So these are big stories and they're brilliant to write about. I've got the wonderful Lucy McRobert researching it, who's a genius and comes up with fantastic stories from my sort of initial research, and that will be out. That won't be out till spring 23. So I've got a year off next year from having any books published.
I bet you any money we'll see a book sneak out from you next year.
No, I won't. Well, I did last year because of Skylarks. Skylarks with Rosie was my other book this year because, of course, the lockdown happened last year and I suddenly wrote the book very quickly. But no, I'm slowing down. At my age, I have to.
All right, well, let's slow this right down and let me ask you a very important question. What is your favourite swan?
You asked it earlier, and I've thought very hard about it. I think it's probably Hooper Swan, because I've seen them in unexpected places. In my 20s, I used to go down to the Forest of Dean a lot to my former brother-in-law's house, and I found these Hooper Swans, which I knew were on this pond, this farm pond. It was bizarre. This family of Hooper Swans would come back every year, and I've seen them again, family parties coming from Iceland, arrive on the Somerset levels. They're quite scarce. Hooper ambulance quite scarce in Somerset now, as they are generally in the south of Britain. And the numbers are, sort of dropping a bit. And I've also seen Hooper Swans nesting on Shetland. And I just think they're a really magnificent bird. And they're probably the bird that inspired Swan Lake, because Tchaikovsky was from Russia, rather than mute swans, almost certainly Hoopers. They've got an amazing, massive world range. They migrate incredible journeys, and I just think they're pretty good.
Well, that's good enough for me. And the second question is stolen from the wonderful Maya Bambrick. If you were to be given £1 million right now, how would you spend it?
That's a tricky one, because what I would have done was go abroad a lot and see a lot of wonderful wildlife and give money to eco-conservation things in places like Costa Rica. But at the moment, A, it's really hard to go abroad, and B, everyone looks down their nose at you when you do it. But I think I'd do a bit of that. I'd probably give some to charity. I'd like to think. I'd set my kids up. I'd spend some of it, and I'd save a lot of it because I'm quite conservative. I wouldn't give it all away though. Sorry.
Oh, so I'm out of the reckoning. Okay. Zoomers, just let you know that next Monday, the 15th of November, we have John Donne here, a writer who was originally an economist and has written a book called The Glitter in the Green, and it's in search of hummingbirds. It's all about hummingbirds. It's going to be a great evening. On November the 25th, we have two gentlemen, Vic Fairbrother and Ken Hutchinson. I'm always kind of thinking Vic and Reeves. But anyway, was it Vic and Reeves or Vic and Mortimer? Vic and Bob.
Yeah. Only Vic and Bob are, well, they are into ring oozles, aren't they? But those two really are.
Yeah, they've written a book called Ring Oozles. Ring Oozles, of course, are my favourite birds, so I'm looking forward to having a chat about. It's going to be a love fest on Ring Oozles. Bless you. And then finally, not even finally, because there's going to be more coming up, but at the moment, on December the 2nd, we've got Eric Eaton, a man who's written a guidebook to wasps. So that should be a very fascinating conversation as well. So I just need to say to you, Stephen, thank you very much for sparing your time. I know you're very busy and you've got a full schedule. Tomorrow night, for example, you're doing the next segment of the Urban Birder World, Stephen Moss, an introduction to nature writing course.
That's right, with some of the people who are here today, which is lovely, yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be running out again next year, so you can also learn how to write books like The Swan and knock them out every 5 minutes. You get all those secrets. So thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome, and I'm very envious of, is it Joselle or Joselle, who has added McGillivray's warbler to her list last month. I'm very impressed by that.
Yeah, that's Joe Seal. And Zoomers, once again, thank you very much for being here tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. The book, The Swan, is out now, and it's just before Christmas, so it's a great present for those who are interested in learning about swans, and it's going to be a very fascinating read for you, I'm sure. And just to finally say, to sign off, and once again pay homage to Ian Wallace, a guy that's basically, set people like myself and Stephen up in the ornithological world, really, in terms of learning about birding, who died last week. And I hope that if he's watching from above, he'd enjoy this show. So don't forget, guys, take care of yourselves and keep looking up.